In this video, we'll be looking at some of the major endocrine glands in your body. This will include looking at the hormones they make, their location in your body, and I'll give you some tips on how to identify these endocrine glands under the microscope. Now, I've already covered the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands in a separate video. So if you're interested in looking at these two endocrine glands, then you can click on a link to this video in the description below. In this video, we'll be covering the pineal gland, thyroid gland, as well as parathyroid glands, the thymus, adrenal glands, pancreas, ovaries, and testes. Let's start off by looking at the pineal gland. The pineal gland is located in a part of your brain called the diencephalon. So here is the center of your brain. This is a mid-sagittal view. Here you can see the brainstem. And then here is the diencephalon, this region. At the back of the diencephalon is where you will find the pineal gland. It looks like this little pine-shaped structure here. So here's looking at a dissected human brain. Here you can see the cerebellum, the brainstem down here. This is the diencephalon, which includes this section called the thalamus. Here you can see the little pine cone shaped structure, and that is the pineal gland. The pineal gland secretes one really important hormone into your blood called melatonin. And melatonin's effect on your body is to help regulate your sleep and wake cycles. It also helps to synchronize our physiological functions with our circadian rhythms, or in other words, our 24-hour internal clock. So it pretty much tells your body what time of the day it is. So here you can actually see a timeline of a 24-hour cycle of the day. So it's beginning at noon here, and then here, where it says 24, that's midnight. And then it goes for 24 hours until noon the next day. And what you're seeing here by the blue line is the changes in melatonin production in your body throughout this 24-hour cycle. You can see that melatonin production increases in the evening. So around 6 o'clock is whenever melatonin levels start to increase. And they reach their peak in the middle of the night. So around 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning is when melatonin levels peak in your body. And then melatonin levels will fall to their normal daytime low by the early morning. So what you can see from this is that melatonin secretion by the pineal gland is going to be greatest at nighttime and is going to be very low during the daytime. So as you can see here, that this increase in melatonin levels as we go into the evening and then night helps to signal your body to tell your body that it's time to go to sleep. However, exposure to artificial light, especially blue wavelengths of light, can interfere with melatonin production. So if you're exposed to a lot of bright light late in the evening, then what that can do is actually lower the production of melatonin. And that can pretty much just mess up with your physiological functions and confuse your body into thinking that it's still daytime. And so that's why it's recommended to limit your exposure to artificial light in the evening and at night. Now let's look at the thyroid and parathyroid glands. The thyroid gland is this large organ that you see here in this image. It's located in the front of your throat, right below your larynx or your voice box. The parathyroid glands are 4 clusters of cells located on the posterior side of the thyroid gland. And you can see the parathyroid glands highlighted in purple in this animation here. When the cells of the thyroid gland are prepared in a microscope slide, they appear as these dark purple cells surrounding these fluid-filled sacs. So it's very easy to identify the thyroid gland in a microscope. The thyroid gland produces several types of hormones, and I like to put them into 2 categories. The first category are what we call the thyroid hormones, and this includes T3 and T4. T3 stands for triiodothyronine, and T4 stands for thyroxine. The numbers 3 and 4 are indicating the number of iodine atoms that are found in each one of these hormones. So iodine is extremely important in the production of thyroid hormones. If you have an iodine deficiency, then that can affect your body's ability to make these thyroid hormones. T3 and T4, or in other words, the thyroid hormones, are really important in increasing our metabolic rate and increasing our body temperature. So if you suffer from something known as hyperthyroidism, that means that you're making too many thyroid hormones. So you may have an elevated metabolic rate. This might result in things like excessive weight loss. If you're suffering from hypothyroidism, that means that you're not producing enough of these thyroid hormones. So that can lower your metabolic rate. And if you have a lower metabolic rate, that increases your chance of gaining weight. Another hormone that the thyroid gland produces is known as calcitonin. And as you can see in the name of this hormone, you see the word calcium. This hormone is really important in regulating blood calcium levels, and it lowers blood calcium levels. So one thing this hormone does is increases the uptake of calcium into your bones. So the bones will remove the calcium from the blood. Now let's look at the parathyroid gland. So remember, these are clusters of cells found next to the thyroid. And para, that prefix means next to or beside. So the parathyroid gland is next to the thyroid gland. When you're looking at a microscope slide, it's pretty easy to identify the parathyroid gland because it's going to appear as a cluster of dark purple cells next to the thyroid gland. And remember, the thyroid gland looks like these little fluid-filled sacs that are dispersed throughout it. Now, the parathyroid glands secrete a hormone known as parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is going to increase blood calcium levels. So it's going to cause your bones, for example, to release calcium into your blood. Parathyroid hormone, therefore, is antagonistic, or in other words, opposes calcitonin. So both calcitonin secreted by the thyroid gland and parathyroid hormone secreted by the parathyroid gland both work together to help regulate your blood calcium levels to keep them at homeostatic levels. So here we're looking at a close-up of the parathyroid gland, and what you can see here is that it pretty much consists of these dark purple cells that are scattered randomly throughout the tissue. The really dark purple areas are, of course, the nuclei within each of the cells. Here you can even see some blood vessels. Those are red blood cells within the blood vessels. One thing I just want to mention about the parathyroid gland is that as we age, most of the cells get replaced by fat. So here you can see the parathyroid gland of a child. On the right is the parathyroid gland of an adult. And these white circles that you see are adipose cells, or in other words, fat cells. And you can see that the adult has a lot of fat cells within their parathyroid gland. Next, let's look at the thymus. The thymus is located superior to the heart, so right above the heart. And one thing I want to point out is that the thymus is much larger in children than it is in adults. So here you can see the thymus in a fetus. Notice how large it is and how much of the thoracic cavity it takes up. And so it's shown in pink here, right above where the heart would be. Now, the thymus in an adult is much smaller, and just like the parathyroid gland, it gets replaced a lot by fat. So the thymus is really important as a site where our T cells, which are a type of immune cell, it's where they actually mature and where they become what we call immunocompetent, where they're pretty much tested in their ability to recognize foreign antigens, or in other words, to recognize pathogens. Now, the thymus is also a really important endocrine gland because it secretes a hormone known as thymosin. And thymosin is really important in stimulating the production of white blood cells, called T cells again, which are a type of immune cell. So in order for our body to produce sufficient amounts of T cells, we're going to need this hormone thymosin to be produced. Now, when identifying the thymus, that's pretty easy as well because it's divided into sections, which we call lobules. So here you can see the separate lobules or sections. Notice that the outer edge of each lobule is a lot darker, so it has this darker purple to it. And then the inner areas are a lighter purple color. So here again, you could see a close-up of the thymus, and this is the thymus in a child. So notice how the edges of the lobules are dark purple, and then the inner parts are this lighter purple. On the right here, you can see the thymus of an adult. And again, remember, the thymus degenerates as we get older. So in elderly people, the thymus is mostly replaced by these fat cells, and therefore the thymus is less functional in adults. Next, let's look at the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands are located above the kidneys, so they're like little hats on top of the kidneys. Each adrenal gland is composed actually of two separate endocrine glands. So here you could see two microscope slides of the adrenal gland. You can see that the outer part of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex. So the cortex is this outer region, and it's going to produce separate hormones from what we call the adrenal medulla, which is this inner region here. So I'm going to outline the boundary between the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla in the left image here. So there's the line. So you can see the adrenal cortex has like 3 layers to it. And then in here again is the adrenal medulla. And then on the right here, it's a little harder to see the border, but I'll highlight it there. So you can see the border between the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Now the adrenal cortex, remember, that's the outer region of the adrenal gland. It's going to produce 3 major groups of hormones. We can classify all these hormones together as corticosteroids, or in other words, steroids of the cortex. So these are all considered steroid hormones, so they're all lipid hormones. The first group is called mineralocorticoids. And an example of a mineralocorticoid that's really important in your body is aldosterone. As you could tell by its name, mineralocorticoids are going to have some effect over the minerals in your body. And so, for example, aldosterone is going to increase water and salt retention by the kidneys. So it's going to tell your kidneys to hold on to more water and salt within your blood. So what it does is it triggers the reabsorption of salt, and then what happens is water follows salt into the blood. And so instead of urinating out all that water and salt, your blood's holding on to it. This is going to increase the volume of your blood and therefore will increase your blood pressure. So this is one way that your body can regulate your blood pressure. That is by increasing water and salt retention. The second major corticosteroid produced by the adrenal cortex are called the glucocorticoids. An example of a glucocorticoid is cortisol. And I like to think of these as your stress hormones. So secretion of these hormones increases in times of physical or emotional stress. And what these hormones do is help promote fat and protein catabolism, or in other words, the breakdown of fat and protein. It also helps increase the synthesis of glucose from proteins. And this doesn't really happen unless your body is in an extremely stressful situation, such as starvation, where you would need to synthesize glucose from proteins. This is not a very efficient way of getting energy, but it is a way for your body to get some energy whenever you're in times of physical stress when it's really necessary. Then the last group of corticosteroids produced by the adrenal cortex are trace amounts of sex steroids. These include androgens and estrogens. Androgens are considered male sex hormones. Estrogens are considered female sex hormones. So there's several different types of androgens, including testosterone, and there's several different types of estrogens, such as estradiol is a type of estrogen. These sex steroids are going to be really important in promoting the development of the male reproductive tract during fetal development. So before the testes have fully formed, the adrenal cortex can start secreting some androgens like testosterone. And then also these sex steroids are going to be really important in menopausal women because the adrenal cortex is the main source of estrogen for females after they have reached menopause. Whenever a female becomes menopausal, her ovaries stop producing estrogen. So the only way that her body's really getting estrogen is through the adrenal cortex. And estrogen has a lot of functions in the body. other than just regulating the reproductive cycle. It's also really important in bone health and brain health. Now let's look at the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, remember, is the inner region of the adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla produces a group of hormones called the catecholamines, and all of these hormones are going to be structurally very similar to each other. These catecholamines include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and trace amounts of dopamine. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine are really important in prolonging the sympathetic nervous system response on the body. Your sympathetic nervous system is a division of your autonomic nervous system. And the nerves of your sympathetic nervous system are going to be most active in times of physical or emotional stress. So we usually think of the sympathetic nervous system as your fight or flight response. So whenever it's active, it's going to be increasing your body's alertness. It's going to be increasing your blood pressure. It's going to be increasing your heart rate as well as your breathing rate and things like that. So whenever your sympathetic nervous system becomes active, it actually stimulates your adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into your blood. And these two hormones will help prolong the sympathetic nervous system response in your body. So it's going to help keep your heart rate elevated for a longer period of time, help to keep your alertness elevated for a longer period of time than a simple nerve response would. Now that brings us to the pancreas. The pancreas is located right below your stomach, and it's located right by the beginning of your small intestine. So here you can see the stomach here on the right. Here's the liver. Here's the gallbladder. You can see that there's a tube connecting the gallbladder and the liver to the pancreas and the small intestine, and that's because the gallbladder and the liver secrete a substance known as bile into your small intestine. But you can see that the pancreas also has a tube in it connected to the bile duct that empties into the small intestine. Okay, so here is the pancreas in yellow here. Now the pancreas is interesting in that it is both an exocrine and endocrine gland. So its exocrine function includes a secretion of digestive enzymes into the pancreatic duct here. And then those digestive enzymes are secreted into your small intestine. The beginning of the small intestine is called the duodenum. But the pancreas also has endocrine functions. So that means it's releasing or secreting hormones into your blood vessels. And the specific cells in the pancreas that are responsible for producing these hormones and secreting them into the blood are located in these clusters, these tiny clusters of cells, or you could think of them as tiny islands of cells called pancreatic islets. So these pancreatic islets are surrounded then by darker cells which have exocrine functions. So looking here, this is a microscope slide looking close up at the tissues in the pancreas, and you can see the difference between the endocrine and exocrine cells here. So the endocrine cells, again, are located in these pancreatic islets, and I've highlighted those regions in light blue here. So all the cells in here are producing hormones that are going to be secreted into the blood, and then outside of that is where we have the exocrine cells, which are secreting digestive enzymes into the pancreatic duct here, which are secreted into your digestive tract. Here we're looking at two more microscope slides of the pancreas. So here you can see the pancreatic tissue zoomed out, and the highlighted blue regions are the pancreatic islets that produce the hormones. And then on the right here is a close-up, and here I've highlighted the pancreatic islets, or in other words, the endocrine cells. Now, the pancreas produces three major hormones that are important in regulating blood glucose levels. The first one is glucagon. Second, we have insulin. And third, we have somatostatin, which is an inhibitory hormone. Glucagon is important in increasing blood glucose levels. And one of the ways that it does that is by converting glycogen into glucose. Glycogen is how our body stores our carbohydrates, or in other words, stores glucose. So just think about it this way. You have a bunch of glucose within your blood. Okay, glucose is a monosaccharide, okay, meaning that it's a single sugar molecule and it is the main energy source for every cell in your body. Now, we don't just have all of our glucose in our blood. Whenever we eat a meal, most of that glucose is going to be stored as glycogen, okay, which is a larger molecule. And glycogen is mostly stored in our liver, but it's stored in other tissues in our body as well. But glycogen is pretty much just a large carbohydrate that consists of a bunch of glucose molecules linked together. Okay, so glycogen is just a storage molecule for glucose. Whenever our body or our body cells need more glucose for energy, what our body can do is glucagon, for example, this hormone, can signal the liver to break down the glycogen and release the glucose into our blood. And that would increase our blood glucose levels. Now, if our blood glucose levels are too high, though, we're going to want to store some of that glucose, or in other words, we might want some of our cells to take up that glucose and use it for energy. So insulin is going to be really important because insulin is a hormone that lowers our blood glucose levels. And one of the ways that it does that is it triggers cells in our body to take up that glucose. Okay, so imagine this. So here we have a tissue cell. So it could be any cell in our body pretty much. And it has an insulin receptor on it. So it has a protein on it that can bind to insulin. When insulin binds to this insulin receptor, it opens glucose channels on the cell membrane of that tissue cell. So here you can see the channel opening. That's going to allow glucose to move into that tissue cell. Okay, so insulin, again, is really important in lowering the blood glucose levels, and one of the ways it does that is trigger cells to take up glucose. Now, somatostatin is a hormone that inhibits both glucagon and insulin secretion. So if blood glucose levels are at an optimal level, then we don't really need to be increasing or decreasing our blood glucose levels. So somatostatin can inhibit the release of glucagon and insulin from the pancreas. Now, insulin is produced by beta cells within the pancreas. And this is really important when we look at the difference in type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So let's look at that next because this is a really important clinical application associated with the hormone insulin, which is secreted by the pancreas. So let's look closely here at what causes type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is caused by immune cells, specifically our T cells, destroying the insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas. So in other words, type 1 diabetes is actually a type of autoimmune disease where the immune cells are attacking your own body cells, and specifically the beta cells within the pancreas. This results in the pancreas not being able to make insulin. Okay, so someone with type 1 diabetes is not able to produce enough insulin, and therefore they cannot regulate their blood glucose levels. Okay, so let's look closely at one of these pancreatic islets to see what's happening whenever somebody has type 1 diabetes. So here's a pancreatic islet. There's actually 3 major cell types within the pancreatic islet, and each cell type is producing a different hormone. Okay, so here we have the blood vessel. Now remember that glucose travels through your blood in order to get to your tissue cells. The purple cells pictured here are called the alpha cells, and they secrete glucagon into your blood. And remember, glucagon is a hormone that increases your blood glucose levels. Here we have also the beta cells, which make up most of the cells in the pancreatic islets, and they secrete insulin into your blood, which helps to lower blood glucose levels. The orange cells pictured here are the delta cells, and they produce the hormone somatostatin, which again, its function is to inhibit both secretion of the glucagon hormone and insulin hormone. Now let's look at what's happening in a healthy body. So here we have the interstitial fluid or tissue fluid, which is the fluid found outside of your blood vessels around your tissue cells. Here I have a drawing of a tissue cell. So remember, insulin is going to bind to insulin receptors on the surface of our tissue cells. We also have glucose channels embedded within the cell membrane of our tissue cells. Now here you can see insulin binding to the insulin receptor. That's going to open these glucose channels so that glucose can then enter the tissue cells. And those tissue cells can therefore use that glucose for energy, or in the case of our liver cells, they will help store that glucose. Now, what happens if somebody has type 1 diabetes? We have special immune cells in our body called T cells that help to recognize foreign cells that might enter our body, like bacterial cells, or it can also help to identify cells that have become cancerous and things like that. Well, situations can happen where these T cells, they make a mistake and they start thinking that your own body cells are something pathogenic or dangerous. So in the case of type 1 diabetes, something occurs where their T cells actually start attacking their beta cells. When that happens, their beta cells are destroyed. Well, that means they don't have beta cells in their body that are functional. That means they cannot make insulin. And that means there's no insulin binding to the insulin receptors. If there's no insulin binding to the insulin receptors on their tissue cells, well, the glucose channels will be closed. And that means that their tissue cells cannot take up glucose anymore. Well, if your tissue cells or your body cells can't take up glucose, they're going to starve. So without insulin, glucose channels remain closed. The cells start to starve because they can't get energy. And blood glucose levels are going to get really high because there's nothing signaling the glucose in your blood to enter your tissue cells and leave the blood. So one sign that somebody has diabetes is having high blood glucose levels, because that demonstrates that your tissue cells are not capable of taking up that blood glucose and removing it from the blood. Insulin injections can help treat people with type 1 diabetes because insulin injections introduce insulin into the blood, and therefore that insulin can be used by the body to trigger tissue cells to take up glucose. Now, insulin injections do not necessarily help treat individuals suffering from type 2 diabetes, and let's look at why that is the case. Type 2 diabetes is most often caused by lifestyle. And this is the most common type of diabetes in the human population, with about 90% of cases being type 2 diabetes and only about 10% of cases being type 1 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes, again, is most often caused by lifestyle. So this includes having an unhealthy diet, especially one that's high in simple carbohydrates and high in sugar. Also, a lack of exercise can increase the chances of developing type 2 diabetes, and certain medications can increase your chance of developing type 2 diabetes. The result of type 2 diabetes is tissue cells not responding to insulin anymore. Okay, so when somebody has type 2 diabetes, it doesn't mean that they can't make insulin. What is happening here is that their tissue cells stop responding to insulin. So specifically, the insulin receptors become insensitive to insulin. So again, usually type 2 diabetes is caused by somebody consuming a diet that is high in sugar, high in simple carbohydrates, especially consuming things like sugary beverages. What that's going to do is create chronic high blood glucose levels because of the massive consumption of glucose, of sugar. So these high blood glucose levels actually trigger your body, your pancreas, to make a whole lot of insulin. And since your body is making so much insulin, you have a lot of insulin constantly circulating in the blood. Well, over time, what happens is these insulin receptors, they're constantly being bombarded by insulin. And so eventually they fatigue. They stop listening to the insulin and stop responding to it. So the insulin receptors pretty much just stop responding to insulin. All right, so let's look at this image down here on the bottom right again to illustrate what's happening in somebody's body when they have type 2 diabetes. Before we look at that, let's just review what's happening in a healthy body again. Okay, so in someone's body when they're healthy, right, insulin is able to help regulate their blood glucose levels by lowering blood glucose levels. So remember, the beta cells produce insulin. That insulin is going to bind to insulin receptors on your tissue cells. And that's going to open these glucose channels, which is going to signal glucose to enter your tissue cells. However, if somebody is consuming a diet high in sugar, they're going to have high blood glucose levels. So they're going to have excessive amounts of glucose in their blood. That's going to trigger an overproduction of insulin. Okay, so now they have a whole bunch of insulin. These insulin receptor cells are now just being bombarded by insulin. So these insulin receptors pretty much just become unresponsive to insulin. They become insensitive to insulin and stop responding to it. So even though there's plenty of insulin, they're not responding to it anymore. The glucose channels are staying closed, and glucose is not going to enter the tissue cells. Because these tissue cells now cannot get glucose because the glucose channels are staying closed, the tissue cells starve. Okay, so whenever you have type 2 diabetes, what's happening pretty much is that although you have plenty of glucose in your blood, the tissue cells are not taking up the glucose, and you're actually starving the cells in your body of energy. So how can we treat type 2 diabetes? Well, it's hard to treat type 2 diabetes just by giving somebody more insulin because, as you can see here, the insulin receptors are not responsive. They're not responding to insulin. So the best way to treat type 2 diabetes is to actually alter somebody's lifestyle. Okay, you want to be eating a diet that's lower in glucose, lower in simple carbohydrates, because that's going to lower your blood glucose levels and help to restabilize insulin production and lower the amount of insulin being produced. So eventually those insulin receptor cells can become more responsive over time. This will not be an immediate change. It probably will take a while for insulin receptors to become responsive again. You can also increase the amount of exercise a person's doing because we know that increasing exercise is really important in helping to regulate blood glucose levels as well. Certain medications can also try to increase a cell's ability to take up glucose. It can also try to increase a cell's response to insulin as well. But again, these medications are not going to be as effective as actually changing somebody's lifestyle to reverse the damage that has occurred. Now that brings us to our last two major endocrine glands, and that is the gonads. That includes the ovaries and the testes. So let's look at the ovaries first. The ovaries are the female gonads. Females have a pair of ovaries. And one way that you can identify the ovaries is by looking at these large fluid-filled sacs, which are the maturing follicles within the ovaries. The ovaries produce three major hormones. The first is estradiol, which is a type of estrogen. Estradiol is going to be really important in promoting the development of secondary female characteristics. So these are the female characteristics that develop after puberty, like enlarged breast, widened hips, hair growth, and so forth. Estradiol is going to also be really important in regulating the female menstrual cycle. And estradiol is going to thicken the lining of the uterus during the menstrual cycle. So at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, the uterine lining thickens. And so that's estradiol that's triggering the uterine lining to do that. The second major hormone secreted by the ovaries is progesterone. Progesterone is also really important in regulating the menstrual cycle because it increases secretions from the uterine lining during the menstrual cycle. So during a female's monthly menstrual cycle, after menstruation happens, so the uterine lining is shed, estradiol is what triggers thickening of the uterine lining. And then after estradiol levels increase, progesterone levels are going to increase in the body, and that's going to increase secretions from the uterine lining prior to implantation of the fertilized egg. Progesterone, that word means progestation. So progesterone is really important in sustaining pregnancy. Again, it's triggering the uterus to provide nutrients to the growing embryo, especially in the early stages of pregnancy. The last major hormone secreted by the ovaries is an inhibitory hormone known as inhibin. Inhibin inhibits a hormone known as follicle-stimulating hormone, and it inhibits its secretion from the anterior pituitary gland. Follicle-stimulating hormone triggers the maturation of the follicles within the ovaries. So inhibin actually inhibits follicle maturation in the ovaries, which is important in certain times of the reproductive cycle. And then finally, we have the testes, the male gonads. When identifying the testes, you're going to actually be able to see the tubes within the testes where sperm are developing. So here we have a testicle or a testis, and inside you can see these coiled gray tubes. They're known as the seminiferous tubules. This is where sperm develop. So if we look at a cross section of the testes, we can actually see these cross sections of these seminiferous tubules. So you see this circle right here. Well, that's the outline of one of the seminiferous tubules, and all these cells inside of here, most of these are sperm that are developing. So when you're looking at a microscope slide of the testes, again, they're pretty easy to identify by looking for circles with dots inside. The actual circles are the outsides of the seminiferous tubules, and inside you can see the sperm developing. The testes produce two major hormones. The first is testosterone. Testosterone is really important in promoting the development of male characteristics during both fetal development and after puberty, so the secondary male characteristics. Testosterone is also important in promoting sex drive as well as sperm production. The testes, similar to the ovaries, produce an inhibitory hormone known as inhibin. And this, just like as in the ovaries, inhibits FSH secretion from the anterior pituitary gland. So it's inhibiting follicle-stimulating hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary gland. Follicle-stimulating hormone helps to trigger sperm development in the testes. So inhibin helps to inhibit sperm production in certain times in a male's life. And that concludes our overview of the major endocrine glands in the body.